Hello everyone, my name is Paul Roberts and I want to tell you a most amazing story. It's a story of intrigue and illicit affairs that happened over 200 years ago, with changes in names, and it involves the Industrial Revolution in England and military service in India, the last Zulu War in South Africa, and then the greatest diamond rush that ever occurred, and then the gold rush to the Witwatersrand in Johannesburg. And the identity of the hero of the story and of his parents and grandparents were all discovered using DNA. This is the story of my great-grandfather, Richard Charles Roberts. For the first 40 years of our family's search into the origins of Richard Charles Roberts in Birmingham, England, all we had to go by were the stories told by my grandmother more than 40 years after Richard Charles Roberts had died. We could find no proof of his birth in England or the marriage of his parents or his identity there. But finally now, in the 21st century, my dad's DNA had given us the first big clue that Richard Charles Roberts had more Italian blood than English. It was a surprise. And my dad's DNA matches had showed that we had fairly close relatives, second and third cousins, on the Richard Charles Roberts side of the tree, who we knew nothing of. And they were living in far-flung parts of the world, from the United States to Australia. I had found that my mother's DNA results were extremely accurate, as we had her tree all mapped out by documents. So I had to presume that this DNA was correct, and we had to find who these relatives were. Once I had sorted my father's DNA matches into family groups, this is the group that were all related through Richard Charles Roberts. Primarily in the group were members of the same family. All these people were from the same K family in Massachusetts, and there were a few others further down on the match list. And obviously very closely related, second to third cousin. And fortunately, one of them had shared their tree at that time, so I could look at the tree, and I saw they were all their ancestors were from very old American families, so that couldn't be where the link was. But there was one ancestor, the great-grandparents of these people, and their grandparent were born in London. They were of Italian ancestry, with the last name Biagiotti. So I looked at the tree, but there were no Rolands, no Robertses, nothing familiar. So I wrote to a number of members of this family, asking them if they had any more information or any knowledge of the last name Roland. I wrote to this person numerous times and never received a reply. I think she has since died, but she was also a close link. These are more of the Roberts family, or Roland family, and I wrote to each of them, asking if they had any more information or any knowledge of a Roland. Some of them had no trees at all. Some had trees with a few people on, but not going back very far. And finally, I wrote to Michaela. And Michaela replied within a day or two. It turned out that Michaela lives in Perth, Australia, and here are the messages I sent to her back in October 2016. I started with just telling her who I was looking for and asking her if she could share her tree as I was looking for this Roland ancestor. And she wrote back, "Hi Paul, I don't know much about our family from the UK. My maternal grandfather was Louis Charles Rolandi, and he was from Birmingham, born about 1901. Sorry I can't be of more help. Well, that was obviously amazing. Roland with an I on the end. I immediately began searching in the Birmingham records for a Rolandi, and the doors began to open. I replied, well, now you have me searching in a whole new direction. Very interesting. And I went on, and Michaela replied back, that's fascinating. I asked my mom about it, and she knew something about a relative who left his family. Apparently his wife passed away in the poorhouse. I'll ask my aunt about it tomorrow, as she knows more about it. Hopefully we can put some more pieces together for you. And then she says she was born in the US. All her dad's family are from there. Most are from Oklahoma and Texas. Both my grandmother and my grandfather had said a number of times that they were suspicious that Richard Charles Roberts might have left a family in Birmingham, England. They said perhaps he had a wife and kids there, and that's why he didn't want to go back to England and deserted in South Africa and changed his name. But that was speculation as far as we knew. But now Michaela Newman was saying that there was someone who'd gone missing in their family. And after she inquired with her aunt, she came back and said it was her great-great-grandfather. He had married her great-great-grandmother very young, and then he disappeared while she was pregnant. And she died giving birth in the poorhouse, and he was gone, never to be heard of again. And the baby, her great-grandfather, was then raised by his grandparents in Birmingham. And he eventually immigrated to Australia. This is the first record we find of the Rolandis in England. There's still no birth, no marriages, but here on the census in Birmingham in 1861, on the Cheapside Street in Aston, there's a Lewis Roland, or on some censuses it's Rolandi, who's the head of the household, 33-year-old picture framer, and he's from Italy. And there's Lewis, ditto, so his son Lewis Rolandi, 3 years old, so born in 1858. And there's also an Emma Thomas, lodger, who's 25, and she's a French polisher. So the immediate presumption would be that Emma Thomas is the mother. Looking a little closer, it's also interesting to note that the Rolandi family lived at number 124 Cheapside. Number 125 Cheapside was a tavern, a pub. So right next door to them was a pub. And we remembered that Richard Charles Roberts had said his parents either owned or worked in a pub, and he was often in this pub. And here is a clipping from the Birmingham Post. On the 25th of October, 1866. And at that time, when Richard Roberts, or Lewis Rolandi, was 8 years old, his father already had his own business in Birmingham. And in this post, it's to John Pickering, a councilman, and these were the businesses nominating him as councilman. And here further down the list is the business of Hawkes and Rolandi, and that was the business of Richard Roberts's father. By 1871, Richard Charles Roberts is now 13 years old and a scholar. His name is Luigi P. Rolandi, where it was Lewis Roland. They've now added the I again, and we now know he has an initial P as a middle name. In the house on Lee Bank Road is his father, Louis Rolandi, and Emma Thomas is still there, listed as a boarder. And his father is a looking glass manufacturer from Italy, and his mother was born in Warwickshire, Birmingham, and so was Luigi or Richard. That same year, in 1871, on the 21st of August, there was an ad in the Birmingham Daily Post for the looking glass manufacturers, the business run by Richard Charles Roberts, Luigi Rolandi's father. Their business was on Bromsgrove Street, and they stated they've had the plant, the only one in the Midland counties, fitted up by Messrs. Gibson & Co. of London, and retain experienced hands for the working of the above process. And here is an interesting article from the paper on the 16th of July 1874, entitled Assault upon a Foreigner. Joseph Thurston's, hostler, was summoned for assaulting Luigi Rolandi, looking-glass manufacturer, George Street, Halsall Heath. Dr. Evans appeared to prosecute, and Mr. Parry appeared for the prisoner. Dr. Evans said that the complainant was an Italian settler in England and had been here for some years. He had raised himself from the position of workman to that of a master. Unfortunately, he had never yet been able to learn to read or write, and consequently had been at very great disadvantage in carrying on his business. He found it necessary to employ a clerk to look after the accounts, and subsequently he took the clerk into partnership with him. Disagreements between the partners, however, arose, and the negotiations had been entered into for a dissolution. He, Dr. Evans, was obliged to mention these particulars because the conduct of the defendant had undoubtedly been influenced by the fact that the dissolution of the partnership was pending. The defendant looked after the horses for the firm, and for some considerable time he had been acting in a most insolent manner toward complainant. And what occurred on the day named in the summons, Friday last, was the climax of a long series of misdemeanors on the part of the hostler. On Friday evening, Mr. Rolandi was leaving his business premises in Pershaw Street, and defendant was in the passage. And when the defendant saw his master coming towards the door, he locked it in his face, telling him he, Mr. Rolandi, was only a common working chap, like the chaps upstairs, and he should go out the back way as they did. Mr. Rolandi replied that he should not go out the back way, upon which the defendant used very abusive language, and when an Englishman became abusive, an Italian was simply nowhere with him. The hostler immediately let himself out, intending to lock the complainant in. Mr. Rolandi caught hold of the door just before it shut, and thereupon the defendant kicked him on the shins, so severely that the marks were still visible. The defence was that the complainant was first to commit an assault. Defendant was fined 20 shillings and costs. The next record I found for Richard Charles Roberts was in March 1875. He was had up for burglary. Here his name is Louis Roland, and his name varies between Louis, Louis, Luigi, and Roland or Rolandi. But fortunate for Louis, or Richard, on the 1st of April 1876, he was acquitted. Here he is down here. Looks like his name is now Louis Roland, and he was acquitted. And finally, on the 25th of June 1876, Louis Rolandi married Annie Hensley in Birmingham at St. John's Church. He was a woodcarver, and his father was Luigi Rolandi. looking-glass manufacturer, and Annie Hensley's father was Henry Hensley or Harry Hensley, a scrap dealer. These are the great-great-grandparents of Michaela in Perth, Australia. So at the age of 18, in 1876, Luigi, Lewis, Richard married Annie Hensley in Birmingham. But this is the census from 1881. And here, Luigi, Richard, is gone. On the census, his father, Louis Rolandi, now cabinet maker from Italy, and Emma, now listed as ditto Rolandi, wife. I found no record of a marriage ceremony, but now Emma's the wife. And there's Louis' grandson, who's 4 years old. The child of Richard is now living with his father and Emma, and they're living on Gooch Street in Birmingham. And here is central Birmingham, as it is today. This area here is the Bull Ring, and there's a big St. Martin's Church in the Bull Ring. And it turns out when we find Luigi, Rolandi, Louis, Roland, Richard Charles Roberts, when we find what his actual birth name was, we'll find he was baptized in St. Martin's. And we will find that he was actually born at this spot on Pershore Street. In that first census where they appeared in 1861, they were living here on Cheapside, next door to the pub, or maybe even above the pub. And then in 1871, they were living over on Leebank Road. And in 1881, Richard Luigi was gone. He was off in Africa. He was actually marrying his first wife in South Africa. But his father and his son were living here on Gooch Street. By the time the 1891 census comes around, old grandfather Louis Rolandi from Italy was 66 years old. He's still listed as a looking-glass maker from Italy. And Emma is his wife now, and the grandson, Louis, is 14 years old and he's an apprentice. And they are now living in West Bromwich, which is a few miles west of Birmingham. They're living on Legg Street. And this is the last census they appear on. They're still in West Bromwich on Legg Street. And Louis Rolandi is now 73 years old. And his wife Emma is still with him, and she's 61 years old. Here is a copy of the death certificate of old Luigi Sr., Louis Rolandi, from Italy. He died on the 9th of December 1903 on Legg Street in Bromwich, West Bromwich. And they said he was 76 years old. He was actually 78. Often you'll find in these old records, people are confused about their age and exactly when they were born, and the census deaths may not be exactly correct. And it might have just been that the people were getting confused and didn't remember exactly how old they were. He was a cabinet maker, and he died of carcinoma of the omentum, which he had for 2 years. It was probably colon cancer that he had. Louis Rolandi, the grandson, was present at the death, and it gives his address. That was the end of my great-great-grandfather, Luigi Rolandi. But we will come to find that was not his real name.
But why could we find no records for Luigi Rolandi? No immigration records, but that would have been unlikely in those days during the Industrial Revolution. But no marriage records. Why wouldn't he have married Emma when she got pregnant? This was all quite confusing, and I wondered where in Italy he came from. The only record we had from the census was that he was born in Italy. Would I ever be able to find a Rolandi in Italy? And then when it came to Emma, could she be his mother?
the amount of DNA that their son, Luigi, Rolandi, Richard Charles Roberts, his amount of DNA showed he was more Italian than English. But it should have been 50-50 if Emma was English and Luigi was Italian. I know you can't bank on these percentages, but it was just a thought. Why would there be such a difference? So while I was writing to other DNA matches and searching out the other roots on the tree, I started investigating Emma and building out her tree. I thought if I could find DNA matches to my dad in one of her family's descendants, then we would have proof that she was Richard Charles Roberts' mother. This is just part of Emma's tree, which I built out. Here is Emma right over here, and Luigi Rolandi. And she had a number of siblings, and her parents and grandparents. And I thought that perhaps if one of these siblings of Emma's had children and their children's children had their DNA tested, we would find a match to my dad, and that would confirm that Emma was Richard Charles Roberts, who would be over here, was his mother. But I searched and searched, and I searched through all the English DNA matches of my dad, and there was no link to Emily Thomas or Emma. As I continued to search through the DNA matches of my dad and sort them into groups, I was sorting all the relatives on the Roberts Rolandi side into a red group. And in this red group, I noticed some distinct clusters of family. There was an Italian group, and there was an English group. And the English people all shared DNA with each other and were purely English, most of them still living in England. But the Italian group were very Italian, many still living in Italy, but a lot of them in the United States. But within the Italian group, I could tell there were two different groups. One group of Italians all shared matches with each other, and another shared matches with each other, but none from Italian group 1 shared matches with Italian group 2. So I began to subdivide the groups of DNA matches into smaller groups. Another interesting fact about the English group was that I knew my father's only English DNA would have come from Richard Charles Roberts, Luigi Rolandi. And his only English DNA would have come from his mother, because his father was Luigi Rolandi, directly from Italy. So it was my great-grandfather's mother who brought the English DNA into our line. So when I was looking at this subgroup of English ancestors within the Rolandi group, I noticed that many of them came from southeast England, from the Kent region. Kent is the most southeastern county in England on the border of the English Channel. Dover is in Kent and Canterbury. That was a little amazing because Emma Thomas, her ancestors came from the Birmingham area for many generations back. But it seemed that my dad's English DNA came from the Kent region. And a few months later, as Ancestry.com updated their software, they were now able to localize my dad's English DNA to the Kent region. And they even showed the featured matches with ancestors or fourth cousins from that region. I then started the process of building floating trees, and I ended up with 3 different floating trees, one Italian, another Italian, and another English. There may be other ways to build a floating tree, but I simply found if I found a DNA match that had a tree and she had her grandparents or great-grandparents recorded, then I would look at the year they were born and see, oh, her great-grandparents are born around the same time as Luigi Rolandi. So I would just pick a great-grandfather and add him as a sibling of Richard Rolandi or Luigi Rolandi. Once he's added as a sibling, I would add his wife and his children, and then immediately go back and unlink him from Luigi. I'd edit the relationship that he's not a sibling. Then, somewhere in computer space would be this other little tree of these DNA matches, and then I could add on and work on that tree and expand it, knowing that somewhere back, a generation or two, the trees would link up. And I did that with the English families and the two Italian groups. By now, I was pretty convinced that Emma Thomas was not the mother of Luigi Rolandi. Her DNA all came from the Birmingham area, and Luigi Rolandi's English DNA all came from the Kent region. My dad had no English matches in the Birmingham area, but a number down in southeast England. So as I was now building this floating tree of the English ancestors, I was pretty sure that I would soon discover the mother of Luigi Rolandi. And that comes in the next episode.